So now we are going to learn about setters and getters in Java 21. So let's create a project in IntelliJ. We'll call it setters and getters. We'll press create there. We'll get our project here, open it up. So first of all, let's just create an object that we can put these setters and getters in, and then we can learn about it by doing. So I'm going to create a user object, and what this is going to do is just demonstrate a valid use case for setters and getters. So if you guys haven't watched the object video in Java 21 that is previous in this playlist, then go ahead and watch that, because that knowledge is going to be important here. Also, if you haven't yet watched access modifiers, which is the previous video in this playlist, please go back and watch that too. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our fields for the user, right? So a user is going to have a username, password, and like a date of birth, right? So usually we'd go ahead and go like string username, string password, and maybe date of birth. Right, that is how we would usually create the fields for the user, but these are all default access. And actually what we want to do is we want to make these private. Now, you're probably thinking, having watched the previous video, why are we making them private? We're not going to be able to access them otherwise. Here's why I make them private, because sometimes you have fields that you want to be able to control different types of access for. So for example, for the password, right, we don't want to be able to retrieve the password from outside this object. We don't want other files or other objects to be able to retrieve the plain text version of this password. We could probably give them an encrypted version of the password, but still that's not ideal. Sometimes we just don't want to give them a field at all. And sometimes, you know, we want to be able to like have a middleman between the sort of outside world from this class's point of view, from this file, the outside world being all the other files in all the other packages. We want to be able to control the visibility and have like a middleman between the outside world and the private fields of a class. And obviously this is good for encapsulation and abstraction as well. In object-oriented programming, those are the sort of pillars of object-oriented programming. So setters and getters allow us to have that layer of abstraction and to be able to clearly control the read and write access of our fields. So a good practice is to always make your fields private, whether you want them to be shared or not. All of them can be private. So a setter and getter will look like this, right? But first of all, let's create an empty constructor. So let's delete this. Public user. We also have nothing in that. But here we're going to have our setters and getters. For the fields, right? So, what is a setter and what is a getter? Well, we're going to code a getter first, and it goes like this. So, for the setters and getters, we want this to be public access, because we want files outside of this package and outside of this class to be able to access the setters and getters, because that is what acts as the entry point into this class. So we're going to create a getter, and all it does is gets the username, right? So we'll call this get username, right? But we need a return type before this. So we're going to be returning a string, because a string is what a username is. And obviously this is just a normal Java method. So we have the scope, the return type, and the name. We're not going to accept any parameters in this get username, so we'll have nothing in these brackets because there's nothing to pass in. We'll be doing it on the object itself. So this will be running on an instance of a user. Therefore, we don't need to pass the user in, and we can use the this keyword to refer to the current instance of the object that we're running this on. So if we want to get the username, since this private keyword allows access for within the class, we can go ahead and return it from here. So we can go return this dot username. And that's it. We've got our getter there. So now we're able to retrieve a private field from outside of this user class using this get username getter. So let's just see if this works. We'll create some space. So now we'll create a user. So before running any getters or setters, we need to create this user. So we'll go user equals new user, and we'll use that empty constructor. And then now to run that getter, we can go user dot get username. And that is how we would invoke that getter. And then that allows us to get the username. So if we go system out and then user.getUsername, that is how we would output the user's username. But obviously if we do that, there is no username because we haven't filled it up, and that's going to be null. So we need to be able to fill in this username, but now we could do it through a constructor. We could create a constructor that allows us to create a user with a username like this, right? We'd go, and similarly to how a setter would work, we would go this dot username equals username, the one that we passed in. Sure, we could do that, and then if we went back into main, we could pass in a username like Ben Neighbor, because now that constructor has been made available and isn't a duplicate of this one because it's got fields in it and it's not empty. If we were to run that, we should see Ben Neighbor. However, we don't always want to do this, and we need to be able to change the value afterwards. So, for example, let's say I want to be able to change my username here, right? I can't go user.username equals because it's private access. So this is where we need to create a setter. Let's go back to user, and we could do that by either clicking user here or pressing Command or Control, hover and click like that. Let's scroll down to the very bottom, and let's create our setter for this username. So again, the setter is just a method to set the username. It's very similar to what we do in this constructor here, and in fact we can actually just copy this line, and this is what will go inside the method body of our setter. So we obviously want this to be public, but we want our setter to return void. Now void is a keyword, and it just means we don't return anything. We don't return null. It doesn't feature this return here. You know, it just does something and that's it. So we want to go set username. But here we want to pass in a parameter, just like we have with this constructor. We want to pass in this parameter here of the username. So we'll string username, and this will be the username that we're setting this to. So inside the method body, we paste, and that is how we create a setter. We set this object's username to the passed in username. Because we're referencing this, it will update that username, and then we can make changes even after we've instantiated the object. I'm going to keep this constructor here for now, but we could get rid of this in theory. So let's try and test that this setter works, that we can change the username of a pre-existing user, and then it will reflect in this output here, where we go ahead and get it. Well, we'll go user dot set username, and inside there, we need to pass in a parameter, which is the username we want to set it to. So it could be, I don't know, Benjamin neighbor. Now, hopefully, if we run this code here, it should create the user with an initial username that we've constructed here of Ben neighbor, but then we want to change it to Benjamin neighbor, and then we're going to output it. Let's run it. Hopefully, we'll get this one here. Cool. So we have the changed username. Now, in theory, if we're changing the username here, we can actually just get rid of this constructor parameter right here and just leave it as an empty. And we would see the same thing. So now we're able to get and set a privately accessed field by having this sort of middleman in effect. But this allows us to protect certain fields that we don't want being exposed. So the example I gave earlier was for the password, right? We want to be able to set a password, but we don't want to be able to get a password. Or if we can get a password, we want it to be blurred out, right? So I'm going to create a getter for the password. Now, we would never usually do this if we have a real authentication system. We should really only be able to check the password and change the password, because then we still don't reveal what the password actually is to other files. But I'm going to create one for getting the password. So we'll go get password. This requires no parameters because we're just getting. And then we want to return this dot password, right? But this is dangerous. We don't want other classes to be able to access the password. So we can just return another string, right? We can return some stars. And then the objects outside of this will never get to find out what this field actually is. But obviously we want a setter as well. So I'm going to write that public void set password. And what we want to do is the same thing as we did here, this dot password equals, and then we need to pass in a password here. So we go string password. I'm going to set that equal to the passed in password. Don't know how many times I've said pass. Someone count and put it in the comments. We can have this setter here, returns nothing. We don't want it to return anything. Now, if we go back to main, we can now set a password for this user. So let's go user dot. You can see we have this set password here. Let's click on that. And then we can set our password for the first time and be like, hello, no cap. And then what we're going to do is we'll get the username. And then we'll get the password, but we'll put that on the same line, like this. So we can just append these strings together like this, concatenate them. And then we want to get the password for the second one. Now, obviously, we shouldn't be able to get this password, and hopefully it won't reveal our password here. Let's run it and see. Cool. So we have the username, but then a hidden password. We don't know what this password is. So obviously, if every time this is going to return that same string, we may as well just get rid of it, right? And then obviously that will cause there to be an error here. So we'd have to get rid of this. But what it means is that we don't even have the option to retrieve the password. We can only set it. And this is what's great about abstraction in object-oriented programming, is that we can essentially create another layer of methods that essentially act as guards, really, for our private values, which can be sensitive. And we can even do custom logic in these as well, as they are functions, as they are methods, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. And setters and getters are a standard pattern in Java. So let's create a setter and getter for the date of birth. So Now let's go public date. Because we're doing the getter, we're going to return a date, which is the date of birth. We'll get date of birth, and autocomplete's got that for us there. We want no parameters. Then in here we want to go return this, the current object, dot date of birth. And we can access this because it's private and we are inside the user class. Now let's do the same thing for the setter. We'll do public void set date of birth. Now I want to pass in the date of birth here, so date of birth. And this is being passed in from outside of this object. So this will be passed in here for date of birth. And these we need to have public access as well. Then we go this dot date of birth equals date of birth. Obviously this references the field on this object, and this references the passed in field. So we are just assigning that to the passed in field. Then we can go ahead and use that setter here. So we can go set date of birth, and we can go date dot from, and then instant dot now. This is using the Java dates API. We won't go into this just yet, but there'll be a video later in this series about dates. And instant.now just takes the time right now. It's a point in time. Let's run this. Hopefully we won't get any errors. Cool. So we're still logging out the username, but now let's copy this line and get the date of birth as well. So we'll go get date of birth. Let's see what it gets. Cool. So according to this, we created a user that has the date of birth of that exact time. So this is my date and time here. So it must have just turned 17. Oh, yeah, we're just about to turn 10/17 on a Monday. And that is essentially getters and setters in a nutshell. Hopefully you guys understood that. If you have any questions, please do comment, and I'll see you in the next one.